third reading today comes from John chapter 10, and it's the first 10 verses. Very truly I tell you, anyone who does not enter the sheepfold by the gate, but climbs in by another way, is a thief and a bandit. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. They will not follow a stranger, but they will run from him because they do not know the voice of strangers. Jesus used this figure of speech with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. So again, Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and bandits, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters by me will be saved and will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. May God's blessings be on the reading, the hearing, and the understanding of his holy word. So the last time I was on this side of the altar, we talked a lot about lambs. Hopefully some of you might remember that. And the important role that they played in Jewish life during the time of Jesus. Well, this week we're talking about the other half of that relationship. We're talking about the shepherds. Specifically, the good shepherd versus the bad shepherds. Our gospel reading from John chapter 10 today picks up in the middle of an encounter between Jesus and some Pharisees. So to really understand what's going on here, we kind of have to do a recap. You know, when you're watching like a series on Netflix and that little thing comes up that says you can skip the recap or you can watch it. Well, this is like you've been watching this series, but you've taken a month or two off and you forget what Grogu and Amanda are doing, and you need to watch the recap this time. So we're going to do a little quick recap of what's happened up to this point. Jesus had just recently healed a blind man. It was a man who had been blind from birth. But the church leaders were not exactly impressed. In fact, many of them were a little perturbed because Jesus did this healing on the Sabbath. No work on the Sabbath. So says Jewish law. Not even miracles. Now, Pharisees can sometimes just seem like the bad guys to us today when we read the Bible. You know, they're like the Washington Generals and Jesus is the Globetrotters, right? There's a comparison you may have never thought you'd hear. But just like the Generals always lose to the Globetrotters and everybody's kind of rooting against them, today everybody's always rooting against the Pharisees. But that's really not how it was in Jesus' time. Now, it wasn't. The Pharisees were the religious leaders of the day. They were the church elders or the church council. They were the guys, you know. They weren't just cartoon villains always losing. Arguing with them would be kind of like arguing with cardinals in Rome today, or maybe driving on up to UCC headquarters in Cleveland and giving them what for. They were generally respected, and they were certainly very powerful. So it was no joke to take them on, to kind of call them out the way that Jesus did. So the Pharisees wanted to call this man in for some questioning that Jesus had just healed, kind of put him under the hot lights and see if they could get him to crack, right? They told him that Jesus was a sinner because he had cured him on the Sabbath. What do you say about that? They demanded of the man, who was probably still getting used to his newfound sight, right? And he said, well, I don't know about that, but he did make me see. Now, not all the Pharisees were quick to condemn Jesus for this. Some of them said, if Jesus is a sinner, how is he curing blindness? God wouldn't work through a sinner. Valid point, I think, right? The Pharisees argued among themselves, as people like that seem to love to do and are so good at it. Then they turned back to the man that Jesus had healed, and they said, well, look, it's your eyes that were open. What do you say? And he answered simply, he is a prophet. Well, that didn't satisfy the Pharisees, so they were still suspicious of this guy. They sent for his parents and proceeded to give his parents the third degree. Is this man really your son? They asked them. Yes, he is, they said. Was he really blind from birth? Yes, he was. Now you got to understand, the Pharisees had made it very clear that anyone that claimed that Jesus was anything other than just a regular dude, another guy, was going to get kicked out of the synagogue. And for a devout Jew of the time, this was a pretty serious punishment. This was a fate almost worse than death. So this guy's parents were very careful about what they were willing to say, but they continued. But that's all we know. We have no idea how he was cured or who it was that cured him. They were basically doing the equivalent of pleading the fifth. It sounds a lot like a modern-day congressional hearing, doesn't it? Or maybe Sergeant Schultz. I know nothing. Remember that? But think about that for a minute. Your son, who's been blind from birth, is miraculously healed by someone, and you don't know who it was or how they did it. You don't know anything. Yeah, it sounds just like a congressional hearing. I can't recall. So the Pharisees brought back the man that Jesus healed and wanted to ask him even more questions. And the man says, again? Why are you questioning me yet again? I've already told you everything. Do you want to be his disciples? Oh, no, he didn't. He went there. Imagine that. You know that got the Pharisees. That really got them riled up. That got under their skin. Do you want to be Jesus' disciples? Can you imagine the courage that it would take? I guess you'd call it courage to say that to the Pharisees. So they threw him out of there. And a little later, Jesus is talking with this man that he just cured. And some of the Pharisees overhear the conversation. I'm sure that was just completely by accident, right? They weren't like trying, sure. And Jesus was saying to the man, I have come into this world that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may be made blind. Who you calling blind? One of the Pharisees blurted out, giving away that they were listening. Well, that's not exactly how the Bible reads, but it does read that the Pharisees said, are we blind? And I'm sure the tone was a little bit more like, are you calling us blind? So Jesus turned to the Pharisees and he said, no, worse than that. You claim to see and yet refuse to see what is in front of you. And that's where today's reading picks up, right at that point. Right after that little exchange with Jesus and those Pharisees. And Jesus continues in our reading from today. He said, I tell you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door is a thief and a robber. Now we know that he was saying that to those Pharisees, right? And once again, we've got one of these images that's totally familiar to everybody that was listening at the time, but may seem a little odd to us. I mean, what is this sheepfold thing? A sheepfold is a structure, usually of stone in this area, because trees were essentially non-existent, but stones were all over the place. So they would stack stones in a circle or a sort of semicircular shape, 4 or 5 feet high. They're still over there. You can find pictures of them. And it was high enough to keep the sheep in and the predators out. And they left one narrow opening. So it's like a corral. We think of it like a pen, sheep pen. That's a sheepfold. So if you wanted to get in or out, you had to go through that one narrow opening. And that opening would only fit one sheep at a time. And that made it easier for the sheep herder to count the sheep on their way in and count the sheep on the way out. It must be hard to stay awake when you're a shepherd and you're always counting the sheep, right? Get it? Sheep count? So anyway, the shepherd would lay across that narrow opening so that no sheep could get out without him noticing, and no predators of the 4 or 2-legged variety could get in. I am the door, Jesus said. Anyone that enters by me will be saved. He is the shepherd guarding that narrow opening. I am the good shepherd, Jesus said. The good shepherd knows his sheep, and his sheep know him. Now, in certain areas, there were large sheepfolds built to contain several flocks of sheep. In important towns or major crossroads, areas where a lot of sheep would pass through. And in these large sheepfolds, The flocks would mix together. They'd have 3, 4, or 5 flocks all in there at the same time. They'd all mingle and get all mixed up. How in the world does a good shepherd get just his sheep to come back out without all the other sheep kind of following along with him? Well, the good shepherd knows his sheep, and his sheep know him. The good shepherd will stand outside that narrow gap, and he calls out to his sheep, and they come to him because they know his voice. And only his sheep come because the other sheep don't know his voice. It's actually pretty impressive to see. You don't think real highly of sheep, but you watch them, and they do. They will respond to the shepherd's voice. But it's not enough to have a good shepherd. You have to be a good sheep, too. You have to know your shepherd's voice. We have a lot of voices calling us out of the sheepfold, but they're not all our good shepherd now, are they? Some are quite the opposite. Some of those bad shepherds are on our TV, or on our social media, or like the Pharisees, right in our own church. The Pharisees certainly weren't the last religious leaders to lose their way and lead their flocks away from the true and good shepherd. Now, were they? Be careful what shepherd you listen to. I am the good shepherd, Jesus said. And this is a continuation of David's psalm that Bill read earlier, where David starts, "The Lord is my shepherd." Psalm 23. That's going to be the most famous and loved psalm of all, right? It may be the most famous and loved passage in all of the Bible. I mean, you know how a band puts out a greatest hits CD and they'll put like their 15 really good songs on it that everybody wants to hear. If there was ever a greatest Bible hit CD, Psalm 23 would have to be on there. I mean, it's definitely one of the most beloved passages of the Bible. And I like to read it in the King James translation myself because it just has a more poetic sound to it. But it is really a beautiful passage. It's worth repeating a little bit. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. God provides me with everything I need. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. God leads me to where I need to go, a place of peace and tranquility. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Well, God leads me in the right direction. He is the good shepherd. And when I listen to him, he cleanses my soul of all the worldly distractions dragging me down. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. There is actually a valley of the shadow of death in the Holy Land. It's south of the Jericho Road, and it goes from Jerusalem down to the Dead Sea. It's a narrow passage through the mountain range, and sheep are moved through this valley for seasonal feeding. The valley itself is about 4.5 miles long, and its sidewalls are over 1,500 feet high in certain places, but the bottom is only 10 or 12 feet wide. Travel through the valley is dangerous because it's often subject to flash floods and things, and so the floor has deep gullies and holes and things, lots of places where a sheep can get hurt or lost. Actual footing on solid rock is so narrow in some places that a sheep can't even turn around. It's an unwritten law of the shepherds over there that flocks must go up the valley only in the morning and down the valley only in the evenings. That way they don't ever meet in the middle, because that'd be a mess if they did that. And they've been doing that for centuries. The valley seems like a pretty bad place to be when you're the sheep. When we are walking through darkness, it is because the good shepherd is leading us to a better place. Sheep keep their heads down and really only see the next bit of grass or clover that's right in front of them. Sheep will literally step off a cliff or into a sinkhole because they don't bother to look up. That's why we need a good shepherd, so we don't walk off a cliff. If a sheep does step off the path into one of the gullies in the valley, the good shepherd uses the crook of his staff to reach down and grab a sheep around the neck and pull it back up onto the path of righteousness that he leads us to. While passing through this dangerous and dark valley, the sheep may think, what kind of fool shepherd are we following? Why is he taking us through this shadowy valley of death? But the shepherd knows that valley is the best way to get to the good pasture that we need to survive. So even though it may seem like our shepherd has led us to the worst place on earth for no reason, there is a very good reason. We just can't see it because we're too focused on that bit of clover right in front of us. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. God provides everything we need, and more than enough. So much more abundance that there's even enough to anoint our heads with oil. Fill our cups until they run over. This is a feast, and it's in the presence of our enemies. In the Jewish tradition, a host was responsible to not only meet a guest's every need, but to also protect him from any enemies. So not only does God protect us, his guest, from our enemies, but he sets a big old table for us right in front of them. Take that, enemies. The table is prepared. All we have to do is accept the invitation. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. We have a good shepherd who knows our name and who calls to us to follow him. We have bad shepherds who call to us and yearn for us to follow them. Unfortunately, we can't just ask, will the real good shepherd please stand up? No, we have to recognize the voice of our good shepherd and follow him and leave the thieves and robbers behind. We have to ignore the calls of the bad shepherds who enter the sheepfold without going through the gate. We must have the courage to challenge those bad shepherds, just as Jesus challenged the Pharisees, even when they're inside our own sheepfold, inside our church. Even when all the other sheep seem to follow them, we must follow the good shepherd. We must listen for his voice. If we do that, then surely goodness and mercy will follow us all the days of our lives, and we will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.